I thought this evening I would speak about an important topic that I haven't addressed in a while, and that's the dependent origination, Paticca Samuppada. This is one of the critical teachings of the Buddha. In one place, the Buddha said that seeing the dependent origination is seeing the Dhamma. It underpins so much of the teaching. In its simplest formulation, it's a assertion of the law of causality in general. This is sometimes called the general dependent arising. And it's expressed in the form when this arises, that arises, when this ceases, that ceases. It's a very succinct, compact kind of a statement, and it almost sounds like a truism, but philosophically it's an important assertion, and a quite radical one. The Buddha is saying that the law of cause and effect is universal, and this is expanded on in other passages, that nothing arises by blind chance or by arbitrariness. Everything arises according to causes and conditions. This is an idea that underpins Buddhist philosophy throughout the Buddhist teaching and subsequently in later centuries. It's a foundation stone of Buddhist thought. There's a denial of arbitrariness. In this aspect, the dependent origination is considered one of the ways to understand middle path, middle way. In the Brahmajala Sutta lists the 62 wrong views, and it's a very philosophical treatise that discusses all the different permutations of wrong view. I think many people approaching that sutta, if they read it through without any background, they imagine that the list of the 62 views is rather arbitrary, that it's a formulation of kind of a matrix of views. And it can be read that way, but one important Buddhist scholar, Jan Taleki, he's written a book, Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge, that a large part of that book is an analysis of the views in that sutta. And they do represent, he was able to identify most of them as representing actual schools that existed in ancient India. Ancient India was a very fertile ground for philosophical and spiritual speculation. So the Buddha went through all these different views, but they can simplify down, even though there's 62 of them listed, they simplify down to two main categories and one kind of outlier. The two main categories are annihilation view and eternalist view, Uchedavada and Sasatavada. And the outlier is eel-wriggler's view, is the literal translation from the Pali. The eel-wriggler view is what we would call agnosticism. And the Buddha's treatment of that one is rather to ridicule it. He gives a statement by one of the proponents of this view as saying, well, I don't say it's this, and I don't say it's that, and I don't say it's neither, and I don't say it's both, and I don't say it's either one, and I can't say for sure. And he says, in the end, he says, this view comes down to either stupidity or cowardice. So he's rather dismissive of this agnostic view. But the two principal views, Uchedavada and Sasatavada, even down to the present day, these two views are outside of Buddhism. These are dominant views in one form or another in society, and they're irreconcilable adversaries. And I think in Western society, you have the religious view of monotheistic religions, Christians and so on, versus materialists and atheists. And this is the big kind of philosophical dispute. It plays out in many different ways. And this was present in ancient India as well, in a different form. But from the Buddhist point of view, both of these, and they're called the extreme views, both of these views share in common one feature, that they break down at some point and are unable to rely on cause and effect. They have to allow some degree of randomness or arbitrariness into their explanation of things. In the theistic view, it's the arbitrary will of the Creator. You can take an explanation so far back and then you have to say, well, that's God did it. We can't say anything more. In the materialist view, it falls back on randomness. Things are the way they are just because that's so. That's just the way they are. There's no real reason for it. The Buddhist explanation always tries to be relying on cause and effect. And there's no kind of stopping point to that. There's no first cause in Buddhism. So within the context of ancient India, and we should always consider things, Buddhist teachings, first in that way, in context of the time, it was a strong philosophical statement. He was staking out a ground in the philosophical milieu of ancient India. The Buddhist teaching always has to be considered from the point of view of the practicality of liberation. This was always the intention of the Buddha, that his teachings would be help beings to attain to full awakening and liberation from samsaric existence. So they always had a spiritually practical end. So this general philosophical principle is expanded and expounded in what is called the specific dependent origination. This is the 12 nidanas, which is a particular case study of how cause and effect works in the case of ordinary human existence. And the intention of this is to explain how this whole mass of suffering comes to be. And there are 12 nidanas, or stages, or links, or whatever, however you want to think of them, that are given as a sequence of cause and effect. And there are different ways of interpreting it, and there's been a lot of discussion and over the centuries and down to the present day in Buddhist circles about the exact interpretation of dependent arising. I like to say that when in my time as a bhikkhu, I've only seen two topics that, when debates or disputes arise, that bhikkhus can get really passionate about. One of them is the interpretation of dependent origination, and the other is the allowability of cheese in the afternoon. Seem to be the two big contentious issues. Generally, there are two schools of thought of interpreting the dependent origination. One is what has been called, as a shorthand, has been called the 3 lifetimes view. And this is the view that interprets the whole 12 stages as taking place. It's called 3 lifetimes, not because it refers to 3 lifetimes. It actually refers to an infinity of lifetimes, but it refers to past lives, present life, and future life. And the other interpretation is the instantaneous or momentary interpretation that sees it unfolding moment by moment. My own opinion, to throw that in as a disclaimer, I think these two views are not incompatible. I view it as the same processes occurring at different levels and different timescales. but it's the same underlying principle. The 3 lifetimes model is the one that is explained in great detail in the Visuddhimagga. And the Visuddhimagga actually also mentions the other view, but doesn't expand it. And the 3 lifetimes interpretation is more naturally supported by the expansion of the terms given in the suttas. Although the suttas, as often the case, the suttas are rather concise and subject to different interpretations. The 12 stages can be considered as an infinite loop, but in terms of, and there are also different variations of the order given in different suttas and slightly different ways of expounding it. But usually it begins with the first term being ignorance, avijja. And this said, as it says in the Visuddhimagga, this is not the ultimate beginning. There is no ultimate beginning, but it's the most useful point for teaching, to begin at this point. Avijja is not knowing. Ignorance is a very good translation for the word. The English word ignorance comes ultimately from a Greek root, gnosis, which also means not knowing. And avijja means not knowing or not understanding. And it's not understanding primarily the Four Noble Truths, which is why beings wander endlessly in samsara. So we start from a point of view of ignorance, of not understanding. Beings in existence, in all various forms of existence, they don't fully understand their situation. They don't understand where they are, how they got there, where they're going. They just carry on in this state of not knowing. And the next stage is sankhara, which is volitional action. Sankhara is a multivalent term. It's used in different contexts with the overlapping but slightly different meaning. The most general meaning of sankhara is any compounded formation. So that's every possible thing in the world, in the universe, except for nibbana, is a sankhara. All samsaric objects, one way or the other, are compounded, dependent. So they're sankharas. More narrowly, it refers to the one of the 5 aggregates, the aggregate of mental formations, the mental processes other than consciousness and perception and feeling. All the rest, all the thoughts and volitions and so on, are sankharas. In terms of the dependent origination, it refers specifically to a subset of these, that is, volitional formations, karma-making formations, formations that have intention as a foundation. And beings in any form of existence, as we said, they're ignorant. They don't fully know, and so they take action without fully knowing what they're doing. It's like they're thrashing in the dark. This is sankhara. It's like a movement originating in the mind, but then carrying on with speech and body, that has a basis in not knowing. The actions of a Buddha or an Arahat make no karma. They're in Abhidhamma, they're classified as a separate category. They're kriya, they're functional. But the actions of any being who's not fully enlightened, they are karmically effective. They always have a ripple effect. The next stage is vijnana, and this is explained in the sutta as being patisandhi vijnana, rebirth linking consciousness. And this is where the 3 lifetime model is supported by the suttas. The sutta identifies this as rebirth linking consciousness. So from being ignorant and making karma, then consciousness arises based on those previous karmic actions. So beings take rebirth in this or that realm of existence, in this or that form, according to their previous karma that they've made. So the karmic actions are what determines the specific type of rebirth, whether it's as a human or an animal or a deva or whatever. Consciousness having arisen in a new form is the seed. The vijnana is like the seed that then proceeds into the formation of a being. This is nama-rupa, the next stage. Nama-rupa is literally, it means name and form. It means body and mind. So in the case of a human rebirth, which we're particularly interested in this explanation, case of a human rebirth, the patisanda vijnana first arises in a single moment, mind moment, in the womb of the mother at the moment of conception. And then the embryo unfolds, this is nama-rupa, all the form and organs and limbs and so on of the being unfold and develop. And on the basis of nama-rupa, name and form, there arises as part of that, and as the next stage, there arises the six senses. That a being arising in the world in the human form has six senses. There's the five physical senses and the mind sense. In Tibetan tradition, they represent all these stages in iconography. We've got a few versions around here. There's one hanging in the library of the Wheel of Becoming. And the six senses are shown as a house with six windows. It's like consciousness contacts the outside world only through these six senses. This is how information comes to the being. And when any object is touched by the senses, this is the moment of contact, phassa. This is the next stage. And this is defined, phassa is defined as three things coming together: the viable organ of sense, the sense consciousness, and object. So if you see something with the eye, you look at a flower with the eye, all three must be present to be a moment of contact. If there's no flower there, there's nothing seen. That's no object, so the seeing of a flower does not occur. If the eyes are closed or it's dark, you also don't see because the organ of sense is not active. Or if you're asleep, you're not conscious in that same way. You're not fully conscious, then you don't see it either. So all three must be present for the moment of contact to occur. And immediately after contacting something with the senses, then the next stage that arises is vedana, feeling. This is the immediate reaction to every sense impression, that the mind has a feeling. It's either pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. And these are, of course, on a spectrum. Things can be ecstatically, wonderfully, blissfully pleasurable, or they can just be mildly pleasant, or they can be agonizingly painful, or they can just be mildly irritating. So that the feeling has a range, but it can be classified as pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And this occurs instantaneously, and we don't really have any control over it. It's a resultant. And all these stages that we've discussed so far, from Patisandhi Vijnana down to Vedana, this whole range are considered resultant. And this is present life resultant. That this is what's going on in the present life, and their resultant means that they are the result of previous actions, previous causes, previous karma, and there's nothing to be done about it. This is just like the cards you're dealt. This is where you're at. So this, and what's important detail here to note and to consider is that this factor of feeling, of Vedana, is a resultant. You feel pleasant, you feel unpleasant. That's not something you're doing. That's not something you have really a control over. That's a result of past causes. But now at this point we turn a corner and we get into the stages subsequent to this are present life effective. Meaning that now we're making fresh karma. We've got the results of karma down to the point where we've had a sense contact and a feeling. But now what do we do with it? You've been dealt the cards, now how are you going to play them? So this next link is between feeling and tanha, craving, is considered to be very important for practice. And Ajahn Buddhadasa speaks about this quite a bit. That's one of his main teachings, is that this particular link is critical to, first of all, to be aware of it, and you have the freedom now, if you choose to exercise it, not to feed the process. You can break the chain at this point. If you miss it and you go on to the subsequent stages, it becomes increasingly more difficult to break it. You end up going around the loop again. And in the momentary interpretation, this is happening again and again, each moment of time. Because obviously in a lifetime we only have one moment of Patisandhi Vijnana, but we have many, many moments of sense impression and many, many moments of feeling. This is just constantly going on. And the feeling feeds into craving, tanha. And if you think about it, you think about craving, before I specify the precise meaning of tanha, think about craving in general. The mind craves many things. We have many, many cravings, specific cravings. But if you think of anything that you crave and analyze it back far enough, you think, why do I want this thing? Why do I crave it? In the end, it always comes back to feeling. You crave this thing because you think or you know from past, having touched it in the past, that this will give me a pleasant feeling. So it's actually the feeling that you're craving. Everything else is a vehicle for a means to an end, a way of achieving this happy feeling, pleasant feeling. So feeling is what feeds craving. Now, tanha is a very specific term. Could be translated as thirst. It refers to specific kinds of desire or craving. There's a more general term, chanda. A difference between tanha and chanda is important to understand. Chanda, is the more general term, is in itself ethically neutral. It can be a positive or a negative depending on the object. It's desire in general. So there's desire for sense objects, which is a spiritually negative, but there's also the desire, the chanda, for liberation, dhamma chanda, which is necessary for the path. And you sometimes hear people with a limited understanding criticizing the teaching because they say, well, if you have no desire, you can't do anything. But they're not understanding the difference between tanha and chanda. The Buddha didn't say that we should be completely without desire in the general sense. We have to have a desire to practice, a desire for liberation, a desire for compassion, a desire for, you need some kind of chanda to get out of bed in the morning. Chanda is the motivating force for what we do. But tanha is more narrow. It specifically refers to three kinds of craving. There's kama tanha, the craving for sense objects. Kama is not, it's not kama, it's kama, is a different word. It's sensuality or sense experience is kama. And that's K long A M A. As in the same in Sanskrit, and you have the famous or infamous text, the Kama Sutra, that's the word. So kamha tanha is craving for sense objects. That's fairly easy to understand. We want pleasant sense objects, tastes, touches, sounds, sights. The other two are bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. Bhava tanha is the desire for existence or desire to be. In its most basic form, it's just that, simply desire to be. But it's experienced in day-to-day living often as a desire to be something particular, to be something more. I want to be rich, I want to be famous, I want to be popular, I want to be president of the USA. These are bhava tanha, driving those particular desires. Vibhava tanha is the desire to not be, and in its most basic form is the desire for annihilation, desire for non-existence. In day-to-day form, it's the desire to reduce or blot out consciousness, because being conscious can seem like a burden. So we want to reduce that. Oversleeping, taking intoxicants, dulling out in front of the TV set. These are forms of vibhava tanha. I want to be less. Bhava tanha is I want to be more. Vibhava tanha is I want to be less. I want to curl up in a ball and throw a blanket over my head and not deal with stuff. That's vibhava tanha. Of those three, kama tanha, in our level of existence as human beings, we're part of the kamha plane of existence. This is the most noisiest, the most obvious, the most prominent immediately to the mind. We're constantly driven by sense desire, which includes the negative form of wanting to escape from discomfort and pain. That's also included. So this takes up a lot of our attention, and it's a prominent defilement in one form or another. But it's relatively superficial compared to the other two. They're more deeply rooted, and they're more fundamental. And it's not to say that kamha tanha is easy to overcome, but relatively it's easier to overcome than the other two. They're more deeply rooted. And they're only fully overcome by the arahant. Even the anagami still has degrees of these present in the mind. When kama tanha is quiescent, if it's not eradicated but it's quiescent, then it allows the mind to, it's one of the defilements that hinders the mind from entering jhana. That as long as there's kama tanha present in the mind, that the mind cannot subside into jhana. But bhava tanha, vibhava tanha are still present even in Brahma gods, which is the equivalent of jhana consciousness. So tanha arises from craving, and it's possible with mindfulness of feeling, vedanusati, knowing the feeling. It's possible to stop it there, stop at feeling and not go on to creating new kama. But if the feeling arises in this craving, then we start a new cycle, right? And it becomes increasingly difficult to break the chain until it carries on from stage to stage. This is the weak point. After tanha, the next stage is upadana. It's usually translated as clinging, although a more literal translation would be fuel. And it's used in a mundane sense as like firewood or coal, fuel for producing heat. And this is the fuel for becoming, which is the following stage. Upadana, as clinging or as it's usually translated, is refinement out of craving. That it's when the craving becomes a project. Tanha is a pretty primitive mind state. It's just a wanting, a movement of the mind towards the desired object, or a recoiling away from the unpleasant object. But it's very little complexity there. But when you get to this next stage, then it starts to become, this is the stage when we begin to create a self. It becomes a kind of an endeavor, a project, because there's a desired object, and now there is a possessor and a possessed. Even if it's just an illusory or imaginary or a desired possession, there's still a relationship set up between I and that. There's a polarity set up, there's a duality. And clinging is how we begin to create a self as the holder, as the vessel for the desired object. Clinging is when we begin to create a self, and once we reach this stage, it's much more difficult to break free. There's a story that I think it originates with Ajahn Chah. It's told how to as an illustration of clinging, of how the village people in Thailand capture a monkey. They get a coconut and drill it a small hole in one end and a bigger hole in the other end, and empty it out, and then they pass a rope through it with a knot so that it's held to a post or to a tree by the small hole, and they put some kind of delicious fruit in the other hole, and the monkey comes along and he reaches in to get the fruit, and then he tries to pull it out, but the hole has been made such a size that he can get his hand in, but he can't get his hand as a fist with the fruit in it. He can't get it out. And of course he could easily escape if he let go of the fruit, but they won't. They're not going to let go of this fruit. So then they end up being caught. And they'll struggle for a long time trying to get their fist out of this hole. And this is clinging, And then after clinging comes the stage of bhava, becoming. We come into existence. Now this self we've started to create is fully formed. Now we're, we have this illusory self. We have this now. We're fully embedded in duality. Now there's a self structure. And following from this is birth, then old age, sickness, and death. And in the momentary interpretation, these are taken metaphorically, and each time there's a desired object, there's craving and clinging, and then we come into existence and it all falls apart and we suffer somehow or other from it, then we're no further ahead and we're ignorant again and we start the whole thing again. It's like endlessly banging your head against the wall. Or like the hamster running on the wheel. It's the samsara is always depicted as a wheel. See, in the root of the word is going around, circling around. And in the three lifetimes interpretation, this is literally birth and old age and death. And this is the future resultant. That the karma we're creating in this lifetime is setting us up for subsequent birth, old age, and death. Birth, sickness, old age, and death, they always go together as a package. You can't be born without having, I suppose you can not have old age if you have enough sickness early on, but the body will always die. Birth is always followed by death. This is inevitable. And having died, a being is then plunged into ignorance again. You're coming into the world in some new existence. Where'd I come from? Where am I going? Well, how did this happen? You don't know, and so you're acting out of ignorance, and you make more karma, and this process potentially can continue indefinitely. We have to break out of it by realizing the unconditioned, making this kind of sideways leap out of the loop. As long as we're within the samsaric existence, we can experience all kinds of different things and all kinds of different levels, but we're still just playing the same game basically over and over and over. And then there's no way ultimately to win the game. You can only stop playing and walk away from the table. So this is a summary of the 12 stages of dependent origination, and it can be considered as a detailed exposition of first and second truth, the truth of suffering and the truth of craving, the origin of suffering. The dependent origination by itself doesn't deal with third and fourth truth. It doesn't deal with liberation or the path to liberation. It's just an explanation of this samsaric existence, or how this whole mass of suffering comes to be. And if you understand dependent origination, then you have some inkling of the law of karma, and then you understand you're responsible for your own condition, your own actions. There's no kind of excuse or an out of blaming fate or chance or the will of the gods. With the Buddhist view is actually rather stark in that way. You don't get any sort of get out of jail free cards. You don't get any excuses. This is just the way things are, and you're here wherever you are, whatever condition you're in. You did it in some way or another. You're responsible for your own actions and your own mind states. And I think that analogy of playing cards is a good one. You're dealt a hand of cards. It's based on your past karma. Whereas actually in a real card game, it's based on chance, right? There's no chance ultimately in the Buddhist theory. So I guess even in a real card game, ultimately it's your karma determines whether you get a full house or a 6 high or something. So there's no such thing as a 6 high, is there? That would be a straight. Never mind. Where am I going with this? You get a hand of cards, and then you have to play them, right? And this is the difference between resultant and effective. These are terms from Abhidhamma. That some of what we experience is resultant. This means we have no choice over it. We have no control over it. It was already based on, in part, on actions we've done in the past, right? Karma is one of the causes that sets up this present moment. But at this present moment, we have the freedom to do something different. We have the freedom to play those cards. And that can be difficult. It's easy to just go along this, what they call habitual karma, is to just follow in the same rut over and over. And it takes a considerable application of will to break out and do something different. But you can also use that principle of habitual karma to your advantage. If you set up a new habitual karma that's something wholesome, this is something like if you get in the habit of meditating every day. Now, this is a new habit you're setting up. It's a wholesome habit, a positive habit. It becomes habitual karma. And it becomes the easy thing to do. The path of least resistance is to go and do your meditation because that's your habit now. So that works for your advantage. So, I mean, this is, we'll kind of wrap it up, summarize that, speaking today about the dependent origination, first of all, as a philosophical principle of cause and effect. And then they explain it in terms of the 12 nidanas, which explains the human condition, and to particularly pay attention to that turning point where the resultant becomes the new round of effective. And the critical moment of that is with feeling. To notice the feeling, be aware of the feeling, but not to let it turn into craving.